Chapter 11. London, England, July 17th. For hours, automobiles had been coming and going along Great Russell Street, coming briefly to a stop at the far end to discharge passengers before moving on to unknown destinations. Many others arrived on foot. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Council's London headquarters was host to the largest gathering of watchers and operatives seen within its walls in many a year. The table in the fourth-floor meeting chamber had been moved back against the far wall, and still there was barely enough space for the 50-odd people standing shoulder to shoulder in the room. Perhaps 24 others stood in the hall outside the chamber. Most of those in the corridor were watchers, as it had been made quite clear that the operatives took precedence at this meeting. There was plenty of grumbling about that, to be sure. The watchers disliked the idea that mere employees of the council should be given priority over them under any circumstances. To appease them, several of the directors made room within the meeting chamber by staying out in the corridor themselves. No one could really complain outright about their place in the pecking order when the elderly Trevor Kensington stood on the hall alongside them, leaning on his wolf's head cane. Though evening approached, it was stiflingly hot outside. For once the windows in the meeting chamber were wide open, and eavesdroppers be damned, as far as Marie-Christine Fontaine was concerned. Sweat beaded on her forehead, chest, and arms, but she did her best to ignore it, to maintain some semblance of dignity. She stood at the far end of the room, behind the table, with the crush of human beings before her and Sir Nigel beside her. It was an honor for her to have been chosen to speak for the board of directors during this crisis, but she also felt that, in some ways, the other members of the board had picked her because she was the only one among them who seemed to have a grasp on the situation. They were also reacting to the predations of Spike and Drusilla, but Marie-Christine had begun to urge them to take real action, to do something about it. Sir Nigel moved up closer.
"I must tell you, Mademoiselle Fontaine, that I am still quite dubious about this course of action," he said in a low voice. "It would be exceedingly detrimental to the council if our enemies perceived this as a sign of weakness."
It was all Marie-Christine could do not to roll her eyes and sigh. Image, she thought. Our people are dying, and he is concerned with perception. Sir Nigel, she whispered, if we do this right, our enemies will never learn of it. And if we do not do it at all, I don't think I have to warn you of the possible outcome. If the Slayer cannot stop Spike and Drusilla, we may soon be dipping from a dry well. We do everything in our power to see to it that each new chosen one has received at least some training before she is called. When unknown girls are called, they tend to have even shorter lifespans and give way, relatively quickly, to one of the girls we have already begun to prepare. But if these two vampires kill all the girls we've trained, we will be in for a succession of Slayers ill-equipped and unprepared for the role. Imagine the damage to the council's image if that should occur. Marie-Christine was pleased to see the grimace on the old man's face. Her words had the desired effect. Shall we begin? She asked, trying to hide the plea in her voice. The sooner they were out of the room, the happier she would be. The heat was pressing in on her and a dull ache throbbed in her head.
"By all means," the old man said, voice low and gravelly. "Let's get on with it before they begin to faint."
With his approval, she forged ahead, explaining the circumstances that had led to such a grim gathering. Wave after wave of shock, anger, and bewilderment ran through the men and women before her. There were many familiar faces in the crowd, but at the back of the room, near the windows, she saw one face she had almost hoped would not appear to her. John Travers, whose father Harold had been her friend and confidant, wore a dark expression as she discussed Spike and Drusilla with the others, relating the events surrounding his father's death. Poor man, she thought. Young Travers saw her watching him, and his eyes flared with sudden anger before he turned sullenly away. Marie-Christine took a deep breath. Several hands shot during that tiny moment's rest, but she ignored them. Now was not the time for questions. Not until she had told him what was expected of them. She pressed on. The Slayer has recovered one of the girls on our list. She and her watcher are transporting her from America at this very moment, but there are 11 other girls on the list who still live. It will take the vampires days to return to Europe. We must take advantage of that time to gather the remaining candidates and bring them back here to London, where they will be kept under council protection at all times until this crisis has been resolved. Nearly all have been contacted, of course, though the war has necessitated communiques in some instances. We have suggested they move to alternate locations and await the arrival of an escort. To that end, all council operatives presently in Britain have been accounted for. Recovery teams of 3 each will be formed and sent out to bring back these candidates. The rest of you will remain on assignment here, working in shifts along with watchers currently in London to fortify and safeguard this building, and to convert some of our larger rooms into temporary sleeping quarters for the candidates and for many of you as well. A team of operatives will also be selected to hunt for Spike and Drusilla, something the Slayer will continue to do as well. Hands shot up again around the room. Marie-Christine hesitated, but finally called upon Kenneth Haversham, whom she had met on several occasions and of whom she was rather fond. Mr. Haversham?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it just seems to me that by consolidating in such a way, we're providing our enemies with a single target. Feels a bit like the American story about the Alamo, to be honest. Wouldn't it be better if we split up into teams to protect these girls where they are? Marie-Christine nodded. I see your point, Mr. Haversham, and it is something the board has discussed. These vampires would happily slaughter half a dozen of our people at a safe house in Vienna, for instance. And no offense intended to your prodigious talents, but they have proven themselves quite capable in that area. I doubt, however, that they would dare make an attack on these premises again when they would have to be aware of the kind of force they would be pitting themselves against. And if they did, well, clever and brutal as they are, there are only 2 of them after all. Sir Nigel cleared his throat.
Indeed. Only 2 against you lot, operatives and all. I rather hope they do come at us then. We'll be rid of them right off then, and not have to be concerned about them in future.
Other operatives still had their hands raised, along with several watchers.
Right then, move along,
Sir Nigel said gruffly. The hands went down. Marie-Christine was relieved. All right, I'm going to run down a list of the team assignments for each of our candidates. Team leaders see John Travers for documents and itineraries. With a quiet sigh, she wiped the sweat from her brow with a handkerchief. Then Marie-Christine began to go down the long list of assignments for those in the room. 10 minutes or so into it, she glanced up and saw that young Travers had left the room. Given his organizational role in this effort, she realized he must have been relocated to another room for space. Still, it concerned her that he was not there. She had come to feel very protective of the man in the wake of his father's death. When it was all over, and the operatives and watchers had dispersed to prepare for their various journeys and other responsibilities, she sought John out and found him on the second-floor office going over a stack of assignments by the light of a green glass lamp. A light tap on the open door drew his attention, but when John looked up at her, Marie-Christine almost wished she had not interrupted him. Ever since his father's murder, the young man had burned with an inner rage that overshadowed his grief. She had known that his fury was partially directed inward, for John blamed himself for not being able to prevent Spike and Drusilla's attack. Now, though, all that anger seemed to have burned out of him, leaving only deep, abiding sorrow. John? Miss Fontaine, can I help you with something? Young Travers sat straighter, composed himself as best he could. Marie-Christine's heart broke for him. She mourned his father's passing as well, for she had loved the man in her way. But John was his son, and it was far from equivalent. Not at the moment, thank you. I had thought that you might like to talk. About your father. I don't mean to presume, but if you ever need to unburden yourself... She let the rest of the sentence go unspoken, her words hanging in the air between them. John frowned, his brows knitting, and he seemed pained even by her raising of the topic. He closed his eyes and composed himself, then fixed her with a steady gaze. I want to do something, he said firmly. Something more. I would like to be assigned to one of the retrieval teams, to be in the field. I need to take a more active role. You're a watcher, not a field operative, Marie-Christine replied. She moved farther into the room and sat down in a chair by the desk. John seemed uncomfortable when she reached out and took his hand, but soon relented. Some of the anger in him drained away in that moment. Council operatives are vital to what we do, but good watchers are essential. I understand your anger and your despair, John. I do. I have lost a great deal in my life, and I confess I was more fond of your father than I ever admitted to him while he was alive. The young man blinked in surprise, and Marie-Christine smiled. The Council needs young men and women of distinction. Your father served with great dignity in this war against the darkness, as your grandfather did before him. We have lost a great many watchers in recent weeks. Good ones, courageous and brilliant people. Our ranks are thin, and we can't afford to lose even one more, either to death or to the roles of our operatives. I'm sorry, but no. Travers hung his head, but his eyes did not seem to focus on anything on his desk. Marie-Christine wanted to say more, but could think of nothing that would assuage the pain John was feeling. She stood, paused a moment, and then went out into the corridor. Miss Fontaine, he called after her. She turned and was pleased to see that though the sadness remained in his features, it had been joined by a new resolve. Thank you, he said. Your father was very proud of you, she quietly replied. I expect he would be even more so today. Geneva, Switzerland, July 21st. On the hills of the right bank of the Rhone River, which cut right down the center of Geneva, lay a maze of cobblestone streets and narrow stone steps called the Old City. The Old City was centuries old, and built without any prescient knowledge of what the future would bring. The narrow passages were built for walking and for wandering, with antiquarian bookshops, quaint flower shops, and candlelit restaurants. In one such restaurant, Charles Rochemont sipped at his French wine and tried to control the thrill of excitement running through him. His companion, Ariana de la Croix, had never looked so beautiful. Despite the war, there were still pleasures to be had in life. Ariana wore a beautiful pale blue gown, and her hair was done up on her head so that strands of it cascaded down in front of her face. She herself was flushed with the tingle of anticipation. But Ariana was not his lover. Indeed, Charles considered it fortunate that, for a girl of 16, She is capable of appearing much older. Otherwise, he would have feared they might have drawn undue attention out together at night like that. Charles had only taken a few sips from his wineglass, and had eaten lightly. Ariana had done the same, though now she lifted her wine in a silent toast. A coquettish smile touched her lips, but he knew there was no real flirtation there, only the excitement of the moment. They had found a vampire. Though he had not cleared it through the council, once they had discovered the vampire lurking in the old city, Charles had determined that Ariana should have her first experience with a kill in the field. He had only been a watcher for 9 months, but there was something so magical and electric about her that he could not conceive of any other girl taking up the mantle of the chosen one next to Need Arise. She was, in his estimation, an extraordinary girl. "To your big night," he said in French. Ariana glanced shyly away, though the smile never left her lips. When the vampire stood up from his table across the room, hand in hand with the young woman he had been romancing, Ariana did not react. But she noticed. Charles watched her in fascination as she tracked the vampire in her peripheral vision. She would make an excellent slayer, he thought. He had never seen a girl so naturally imbued with the skills necessary for the duty. "Let's go," she said, reaching out to take his hand. He had already paid for dinner, so Charles did not argue as she led him out of the restaurant and into the winding labyrinth of the old city. For nearly 10 minutes they walked hand in hand, wearing the pretense of lovers, behind the vampire and his intended victim. Past the Cathedral of St. Pierre they walked, and on through the city until they came to the Promenade des Bastins, where portions of the fortifications from the age when Geneva was a walled city still remained. The vampire veered off then, directing his intended into darkness where the crumbling walls stood. The creature was dapper and swarthy, and the girl giggled as he led her to her death. Charles and Ariana kept walking, his arms around her, as she leaned her head dreamily against his shoulder. After a count of 10, they glanced around to be sure that there was no one else to see them, then turned and ran for the opposite side of the crumbling bastions. They moved silently, just as he had taught her, and when he glanced over, Charles saw that Ariana already had a stake in her hand. His heart surged with pride. There came a small yelp of alarm from the darkness beyond the wall, and then a whimper of pain. Ariana dashed ahead. Charles wanted to call out a warning to her to wait, but he dared not warn the vampire that she was coming. As he watched her outstrip him, he grew anxious, having second thoughts now that the moment was upon them. Though she was in training, Ariana was not the slayer. She did not have the abilities, nor the stamina and healing powers that the Chosen One received. She knew to wait for him. He had instructed her that they must do this thing together, simply because she was not the true slayer yet. But now she had become overwhelmed with her excitement, perhaps even her need to please him, and he feared for her. With a burst of reserve energy he had not realized he had, Charles sprinted to catch up with her. As Ariana rounded the edge of the wall, he was on her heels. By the time she paused inside the vampire, Charles was by her side. He was her watcher. She would not face the darkness alone. Ahead, against the wall, the swarthy vampire nuzzled the throat of his victim. Her blonde hair tossed from side to side as she thrashed, trying to escape him. Ariana and Charles moved more slowly, spreading out somewhat, and now Charles took his own stake out from inside his jacket. Ariana's foot kicked a rock and the creature looked up, features contorted into the demonic countenance of the vampire, eyes blazing, fangs bared in a hiss. "Leave her, vampire!" Ariana instructed, her voice regal and commanding. Yes, Charles thought, she will be an extraordinary slayer. He grinned as the vampire cursed, testing the feel of the stake in his hand, risking a quick glance at Ariana. There was no smile on her face, only a grim determination. When Charles looked back, the blonde woman had moved away from the wall. But something was wrong. She did not run, nor scream. Instead, she snarled, and her face changed. "Oh no," Charles whispered. He moved toward Ariana, keeping his eyes on the two vampires. "This was a mistake. Let's go, Ariana. Slowly." "You're not going anywhere," the swarthy vampire told them, his words punctuated by a low, snuffling laugh. Ariana did not even look at Charles. "We can do it. You've trained me well enough, Charles. Don't lose faith now. They're hellspawn. Whatever the odds, we can't simply ignore their presence." Charles nodded. She was right. It had been a mistake, coming out here, risking her in this way. Stupid. But they could not flee now, and leave the predators to go about their business. Nor did Charles believe, in his heart, that they would be allowed to go. The vampires had stood regarding them with curiosity. Special attention was paid to the stakes they both held. "What are you supposed to be?" the female asked despairingly. Inspiration struck Charles. If he could intimidate them, that might be the advantage he and Ariana needed. "She's the Slayer," he said. The male laughed. "Oh, is she? Met a girl who thought she was the Slayer once. It's just a myth, you old fool. No matter what she's told you." Charles paled. He had never imagined this. While most humans believed vampires were merely legend, it had never occurred to him that some vampires might believe the same about the Slayer. "Are you going to be jealous?" the male asked his female companion. "Not at all, darling," she replied with a gruesome smile. "She's a pretty thing, and you're welcome to her. Besides, The man's handsome as well. Ariana shot Charles a quick glance. Come on, Charles. He nodded. Kill them, he said. The vampires were both grinning cruelly as Charles and Ariana rushed toward them. Their fangs glistened in the moonlight, and Charles found himself almost entranced by them. He faltered and hated himself for the sudden streak of cowardice in his heart. Then it was too late, for the vampire girl was on him. He tried to bring the stake up into her chest, but she slapped it away, grabbed him by the hair, and hauled his head back to get at his throat. As he tried to fight her off, he caught sight of Ariana and the other vampire. She had succeeded in burying her stake in his chest, but had missed his heart. Now he drove her to the ground and fell upon her. She was skilled enough, but he was simply too strong. Charles saw the vampire sink his fangs into her pale flesh, and he screamed. There was a tiny sound, and the vampire girl he struggled with exploded in a cloud of dust. Stunned, he turned around just in time to see a tall, thin, well-dressed man stand over Ariana and the vampire with a crossbow. The man fired a bolt into the other vampire's back, piercing the heart, and the creature burst into a pile of ash that showered down onto Ariana. Charles ran to her. Her neck was bleeding, but she seemed otherwise unhurt. Ariana looked at him, eyes shining with her fear. Then she embraced him tightly. A moment later, the tall man cleared his throat. Charles helped Ariana to stand and face him, only to find that a second man, shorter and wide around the middle, had joined them. He also carried a crossbow, and Charles realized that the stout one had saved his life. "Thank you, gentlemen," Charles said in a tremulous voice. "To whom do we owe our lives?" "My name is Haversham," said the tall man. He gestured to his partner. "This is Mr. Ruby. Council has sent us to collect yourself and Miss Delacroix, Mr. Rochemont." Charles nodded grimly. He had thought as much, and the repercussions chilled him. "What you saw here, gentlemen, well, it wasn't what it appeared. Mere coincidence, really." "Really?" Ruby asked, a quizzical expression on his face. "That's funny, 'cause it looked to me like you was giving your charge here a bit of a test run. If I know my watcher business well enough, which I can't really claim I do, that'd be quite a premature, wouldn't it? For a field test, I mean." "Please, gentlemen," Ariana began. "You mustn't." "Perhaps you'd best stop right there," Haversham interjected. "As long as you're both all right, and we'll all head back to London anyway, I'd be of a mind to keep a firm rein on my curiosity. Wouldn't you, Mr. Ruby?" Ruby regarded Charles harshly, and the watcher sighed. He deserved the man's scorn for putting Ariana's life in jeopardy, but the stout man nodded. "I don't see any reason we can't keep this to ourselves." "Oh, thank you both," Charles said, weak with relief, "for this and for our lives." Haversham's features hardened. When he spoke again, it was in a grave tone. "Don't think us yet, Mr. Rochemont. Neither of you is safe yet. None of us are. Save your gratitude for when you sleep your first night in London. Until then, be more cautious than you have been, sir. There are hunters in the dark, and your girl here is the prey." Ariana's eyes widened with alarm, but the council operative said no more. Charles felt an awful chill pass through him. As they walked back to his rooms, the watcher peered into every shadow. Though he wished she would walk beside him, Ariana strolled along between Haversham and Ruby. She no longer trusted Charles to guide her and keep her safe. He had never felt so ashamed. The Atlantic Ocean, July 25th. A few hours before dawn, Drusilla stood at the very back of the deck of the Madrid, a passenger liner bound for the southern coast of Spain, and gazed down at the ocean churning behind the fat-bellied ship. Though it was midsummer, there was a chill to the wind this late at night and this far out to sea. Drusilla made no sign that she felt it, nor any motion at all, for that matter. She stood at the rail, rigid and still. Her eyes did not move, not even a blink, and her chest did not rise even with the semblance of breath. In the moonlight her skin was gossamer pale. Thin blue veins ran through it like marble. Any crew member or sleepless soul who had passed her during those moments of reflection would have thought her dead, were it not for the impossible fact that she was still on her feet. For long minutes, near an hour, she stood frozen, watching the tumultuous sea. The dead bobbed and swirled in the wake thrashed up by the huge liner, a grotesque ballet of corpses on the water. The ocean swells were salt-tipped gouts of blood, crashing over the buys and painting them in crimson. Hundreds of cadavers, thousands of dead men and women and children. As the vessel pressed on through the night, it carved through the dead like an icebreaker clearing a shipping lane through the Arctic. Below them, beneath the menagerie of rotting, sodden flesh, lay a cemetery of iron and steel. To Drusilla's eyes, the warships and submarines looked like enormous tombstones. It was so cold and still in the depths, broken only by the scream of tearing metal, the ghosts of explosions that haunted the bottom of the ocean. Beside her, Spike lit a cigarette, then tossed the match off the back of the ship. The flame sputtered out long before it reached the bloody sea. "You all right, pet? Thought you'd have come in for now." For the first time in an hour, Drusilla blinked, but she did not turn away from her vigil, nor did she respond. "Come on, Drew. Come inside. You look like a bleeding scarecrow or a flamingo or something. Stand back here like that. You were any more stiff, they'd strip you down to your bristles and nail you to the front of the boat like on them old Viking warships." Drusilla turned at last to regard him. As if that motion was all that was needed to break her trance, she began to sway a bit, out of sync with the swell of the ocean. Her eyes did not focus on Spike, nor anything else for that matter. She was adrift, haunted, a ghost even to herself. "Too much blood," she whispered. "What's that?" Spike asked. "I'm surprised at you, Poodle. Never thought I'd hear you complain about having too much of anything." His smile was sly and suggestive. "Down there," she said, returning her attention to the churning water below. Spike glanced out at the ocean. "I don't see anything, love. Of course, that's not all that unusual, is it? My Drew has always been able to see a damn sight better than the rest of us. What is it this time?" "The war," Drusilla whispered. "It's beautiful in its way. Death always is. I don't want to be sunk again, Spike." As she said this last, she glanced back at him as though he were the one responsible for the sinking of the Aberdeen months earlier, and now he must be punished. "It'd be damned inconvenient," Spike observed. "We should have kept our submarine," Drusilla reminisced, her gaze drifting off again, lost in memory. Spike shrugged. It didn't seem practical at the time. Besides, those boys had their own agenda, remember? Funny thing about Nazis. Turn them into ravening vampires, some of them don't seem all that different from when they were alive. Anyway, they're likely at the bottom of the Atlantic about now. If not, odds are they will be long before the curtain's drawn in this lovely little war. Drusilla tilted her head and looked out over the ocean again. The blood and the dead were gone, and now there was only the water. It made her think of alligators, and alligators made her think of Louisiana. Drusilla did not like to think about Louisiana. She shuddered. Though her skin was all healed now, it felt sometimes like there was thousands of tiny insects, squirming maggots under her skin. After she had been burned, when her charred and cracked flesh had been flaking off, and even the coolest breeze had pulled at the edges, that had been the feeling. Insects. "You're my warrior, aren't you, Spike?" she asked, in a voice so low that she thought even the wind must have barely heard her. But Spike did. "Of course I am, Drew. When you want me to be. Sometimes you like to do the ripping and tearing on your own, right? But when you need your Black Knight, here I am." "You'll kill that Slayer then, and let me watch? I want to see your eyes when you do it." "It'll be my pleasure, Drew. Got to keep to our side of the bargain, though. Doing all the someday Slayers first, then the real thing. Love to have another crack at that girl, and the other one, too. The American. Damned embarrassing, that was. Not to mention inconvenient." They both fell silent again a long moment. Drusilla felt the wind tugging at her hair, whipping around her face as she closed her eyes to enjoy it a moment. "Do I like Spain?" she asked at length. "Don't you remember?" Spike shook his head. "That bullfighter and his daughters in Barcelona that time." Her smile was wicked, her eyes focused at last. Her laugh was a trilling moan of pleasure. "Oh, yes," she murmured. "I love Spain. I liked America, too. Not the South, but the rest. Do you think we'll ever go back?" Spike stood by and slipped an arm around her back. He kissed her on top of her head. "Whatever your black little devil heart desires, Drew. Always." Gulhopigen, Norway, July 27th. In his frozen lair, Skrymir spied upon the Watcher's Council through his icy scrying glass, and he nodded his head in satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan.